Good evening, I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me on our news panel are Michael Montgomery, reporter for KQED News and California Watch; Mark Calvey, San Francisco Business Times reporter; and Laura Sydell, digital culture correspondent with NPR. Laura, have we ever seen the kind of outpouring of grief for a CEO as we've seen with the passing of Steve Jobs?
You know, I have never seen anything like this in my lifetime, and I can't imagine a CEO that people feel this way about. There was a kind of magic that Steve Jobs had, but more importantly, it was the magic he brought to his products. This is a guy who from very, very early on in his life was really believed that you could infuse machines with emotion, that you could make people feel something about a machine. And I think his products did that successfully. You know, you talk to people about their Mac, and they are often in love with them, right? I mean, what other product do you feel that way about? You know, and so I think he had an ability to do that. He always talked about how he had the best computer scientists who were also artists and poets and musicians, and that he brought arts and humanities into technology.
Was it this cross of entertainment and business function that did it? Is that it?
I think not just that, it's also that he made things easy to use. He really was gearing his products towards the average schmo, towards the person who didn't know how to use a computer. And I think you often don't see that in other companies. I mean, I've covered a lot of these companies in Silicon Valley, and I don't think they take the care. He really took care. He was a difficult boss sometimes. People will tell you that, but he had a way of bringing people up to do their absolute best work. People would say, yeah, he's difficult, but he's a genius. And, you know, his head designer, Johnny Ive, came up with these amazing designs. They work closely together, where, in a way, the technology takes a backstage to the thing you want to use it for. It's very simple. And so people would fall in love with the device. They could make it theirs.
Do you think his death marks the end of an era?
I do. I mean, I have to say, I've probably sat, you know, and listened to him unveil a product now over a dozen times. And there was something about him. I mean, I was at Apple the day before he died. They unveiled the iPhone 4S. And Tim Cook got up there, you know, he has a nice way about him. But he's not Steve Jobs. There was something about the passion that Steve had that just came through, and I don't think we'll see that again, you know. And
well, I wanted to ask you about Tim Cook, the current CEO. He's been at the helm for a while, a few years now, a couple years now. What about that question of the magic? I mean, it's bound to continue to be a successful company, probably no doubt about that. But this sort of notion of a revolutionary company, or a company with this incredible magic. What do you see in your crystal ball on that?
You know, not that I have a crystal ball, but there's a couple things I would say. One is, I think for a while we'll still see great products, because there were things in the pipeline that he put in the pipeline. I think one of the things, is my understanding, that Steve felt strongly about was developing a team that understood how he thought. Strangely enough, though, that's almost contrary to, I think, what made Steve Jobs, which is that he was an iconoclast. I mean, this is a guy, he dropped out of Reed after 6 months. He went to India, he did LSD, he dabbled in Buddhism and Hinduism, and, you know, he was not your ordinary CEO. He didn't go to business school. He didn't do all those kinds of things. He was an old hippie. And I think a lot of what you see now in Silicon Valley, they want to be nonconformist, but I don't think they have that something that he had, that kind of magic, as you say.
But he wasn't trusting to fate that somebody would come along and duplicate his magic. I mean, he did establish an internal organization to try to train people, to try to transfer this. How did that work?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, Apple University, which is what they're calling it, is supposed to teach the Apple management style. But of course, that's hard to imagine, because part of it was his charisma. I mean, this was a guy, he had you eating out of his hand. I used to get out of these press conferences where he would introduce whatever he would introduce. And sometimes, of course, it was revolutionary, a word he liked to use. You know, when he introduced the iPad, he called it revolutionary. But I would always call my editor and say, okay, get me down to reality, because I've been in the Steve Jobs famous field of distortion. You know, and that was really special. I think there are probably things you can teach.
Okay, there are a few people around that probably could learn from his magic. They're in the financial institutions of this country, and we're
Right.
going to turn to Mark now and talk about what's going on. And there is not a lot of love on the table.
You've got that correct. There were several protesters again today in front of the San Francisco Federal Reserve, minus the tents, but they were still there protesting what I think they would call the tyranny of Wall Street. They're upset with a lot of what's wrong with our economy today. For many Americans, the nation's economy simply isn't working for them, whether it's foreclosures or the long-term unemployment. And even such down-to-earth issues like student loans, not being able to discharge those in bankruptcy, was part of the topic of discussion with the protesters when I went down there this morning.
But wasn't the main complaint I heard is that this is a group, there are actions across the country, New York here and there, but it seems unfocused.
It does. I think you're right about that, but let's look at the Arab Spring. That also looked unfocused, didn't have a list of demands there either, or a leader. But I think this is the new world of protest within social networking, that there can be a coalescing. And I think a lot of observers are saying, give this time. They're tapping into a very deep channel of public anger, which is likely to spur changes in our country.
Let me ask you on that point. I mean, prior to the official creation of the Tea Party movement, we saw a lot of unfocused anger. Are there any, I mean, I don't want to overplay that, but are there some parallels here, do you think, that it could coalesce and actually channel into a real political movement or force?
I think so. I think what's going to happen over time is people are going to latch on to maybe some key issues like the student loan debt, which is such a problem, or unemployment, especially when you're coming out of college in this environment where I've heard CEOs call the college placement office a ghost town in this era. So I think over time, issues will percolate up that people will gravitate to. What I thought was interesting this week is I'm hearing similar things about the Federal Reserve and criticism from the people protesting on the street as I'm hearing from Steve Forbes, who sees the day the American dollar is once again linked to gold. When you've got both sides of the argument, echoing the same point, I think that again reinforces the idea change is coming. I spoke with one of San Francisco's top financiers, Warren Hellman, this week. He thinks the protests are important and need to be watched because just like in the early 30s, protests of this nature led to some of our strongest securities laws. In fact, even the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Do you think there's a difference between the protesters here in the Bay Area and what you're seeing in New York? Do you see some difference?
Yes, because in New York they have thousands gathering. They're becoming much more maybe aggressive, or adopting the rules of civil disobedience in New York with the blocking the Brooklyn Bridge. I think in the Bay Area, maybe because we're so used to protests that it's taking time, but I know this morning a lot of people were honking in sympathy as they drove past the protest.
The banks seem to have not got it quite yet, because the announcement by Bank of America about fees for using your ATM,
yes,
debit card, also happened at about the same time.
I think some observers feel like Bank of America and the Washington, D.C. are in a catfight of some sort, and the American people are losing in the middle. The same day that President Obama sent his jobs bill over to Congress, B of A confirmed they're going to lay off 35,000 over a few years. They're shutting down some of their mortgage operations. They're putting in this $5 monthly debit card fee. It seems like banks aren't listening yet, but I know the level of anger is there, that I'm confident they're going to start getting the message.
I guess I wonder, you said also that many of the people you spoke to here were really articulate, and that's something maybe I want to say that we haven't always heard about the people in New York, but you and I were talking earlier, you said you were kind of surprised.
I was very surprised that they were able to discuss. They feel like the Federal Reserve is the root of the problem. They understood. They were discussing issues like the fractional reserve banking system that we have in this country. This is not your grandfather's protest, in my opinion, with the level of understanding of economics. It reminded me of Michael Moore doing a premiere of his film Capitalism, a Love Story, here in town, and somebody afterwards said, "Why didn't you focus more on the Federal Reserve?" And Michael Moore laughed and he goes, "I'm usually having to deal with issues like, did the guy get the girl? Not the Federal Reserve." So times are changing.
What about the president, talking about this?
I think he's listening. He was saying he's watching these protests very carefully. He understands the anger toward the banks. I think our presidential candidates, President Obama and next year with the election, I think they're going to be doing a lot of listening to the people on the streets and even in our halls of power about what changes may have to be made.
Certainly, all three stories interesting and worth watching. My thanks to all of you for joining me here on the program tonight. Michael Montgomery, I'm not putting you on the air. Well, Michael, you have a difficult story here for medical marijuana people, and I don't think I've ever quite done that before. But they're already getting a bad road from the federal government, and I'm cutting them off the air.
Well, what really has happened today, we had a press conference with the 4 U.S. attorneys standing side by side, and they really did throw down the gauntlet to the medical marijuana industry in the state. And using that terminology, industry, and really saying that they are going to go after the sort of economic foundation. And we've seen prosecutions over the years. We've seen a cat and mouse game between the feds and local marijuana, medical marijuana folks. What's different now is they're saying to property owners, if you rent or lease your land or your buildings to either medical marijuana dispensaries, although the feds don't use that term, they call them stores, or to growers, like in the Central Valley, which is a growing issue, we might just seize your land. And that has gotten the medical marijuana world very worried. And I think that the federal government really tried to show that they're very serious about this. This isn't an idle threat. And they made that point by standing side by side, the 4 U.S. attorneys, and really, like I said, I think throwing down the gauntlet. And there have been other issues. Tax, the IRS is getting involved with dispensaries. Banks are cutting business ties with dispensaries. There's been some court rulings. Even the ATF now says to gun dealers that you shouldn't be selling firearms to people who are medical marijuana users.
Won't this hurt state and local governments here in California with tax revenues?
Well, that's the argument that a lot of the advocates are making. The estimates are that California earned about $100 million in taxes for medical marijuana. Local governments, Oakland, for example, it does quite well on taxing medical marijuana sales or dispensaries. So yes, local governments, state government, but particularly local government will take a hit. The irony is the federal government is saying to local governments, you can't regulate this. It's illegal to try to set up regulatory structures for medical marijuana. Now we'll see what happens with places like Oakland or San Francisco that have these regulatory systems set up.
You know, thinking about the fact that yes, it's jobs, it's tax dollars, why now? Why would the federal government be coming in now?
Well, there are those who see a conspiracy here, all these things happening at the same time. I know that the U.S. attorneys have been working on this since last year. And it's taken them a long time to get things ready, get things lined up. What they're saying is it's out of control. California has become the biggest supplier of marijuana to the rest of the country. Medical marijuana is going to non-medical marijuana states. It's become a big headache, and it's become a big headache for law enforcement. That's what the cops and the feds are saying. So they're saying, you know, implicitly, California hasn't got its act together on this, and we, the feds, have to take bigger action.
What about this largest supplier of medical marijuana that seems to really be on the hook here for an awful lot of money or an awful lot of trouble?
This is Harborside Healthcare. This is in Oakland. It's the largest dispensary in California, probably in the West Coast, possibly the country. They've had a long-running battle with the IRS over their business deductions, and they lost at least the first round of that battle. IRS says they owe them $2.4 million. The owner of Harborside, Steve D'Angelo, says if they do that to Harborside and other dispensaries, they'll wipe out the industry. They will appeal, but it's unclear whether they'll win.
Why would they appeal in light of this new move, what the government is
saying? Well, they're saying that they should be entitled to deduct regular operating expenses, and the feds right now say no. But this is the IRS. It's not the U.S. Attorney's Office.
A question about, I mean, do you see evidence that in fact there is a lot of criminal activity around this? There are reasons that the Fed really should be worried. Are you seeing that?
Well, we see indictments all the time, and we certainly, there's clear evidence of growers growing large quantities of marijuana in California and shipping to other states where the profits are higher. The marijuana grown in California, high quality marijuana from California, goes for 2 or 3 times the price in other states. So there's definitely a lot of trafficking. There's been an uptick in violence, not so great that it's on the front pages of the newspapers, but the police are definitely worried about
Any
that.
rumors of clubs that have just decided to fold it?
Not yet, but as of today, dozens of letters have gone out to property owners, including the Bay Area, including parts of Northern California, Southern California. They've been given 45 days to cease operations or face possible seizure of the property.
And that applies to the property owners plus
That's
what
right.
they have on the property. Well, again, my thanks to all of you for joining me here tonight.
A pleasure.